Hello there, everybody, and welcome to Things We Said Today, our weekly internet and online radio podcast in which we examine all things Beatles, both in their history and their present and in their future, and even in other galaxies, as we'll be finding out in a few moments. I'm Al Sussman from Beatle Fan Magazine, and I'm here with my three co-hosts. First, the host of the syndicated and internet radio Beatles radio show, Every Little Thing, Ken Michaels. Hi, Ken.
Hi, Al. How's everyone doing?
Great, Ken. And the reporter for Beatles Examiner, who has been busy much of this weekend. In fact, he has a breaking story as we're recording this on Monday evening, and that's Steve Marinucci. Hey, Steve.
Hey, Al. Hello, everyone.
And our resident musicologist, a longtime contributor to Beatle Fan Magazine, longtime critic for the New York Times, and currently writing for a number of different publications, doing classical music and other things. And that's Allan Kozin. Hey, Allan.
Hey, Al. Hello, everyone.
Before we get into our main topic, though, as I said, we do have a piece of breaking news, and as seems to be happening almost on a weekly basis, it's sad news, and it's the passing of Allan Rouse, who was well, actually, you know what? I should have Allan really kind of give you a full kind of bio on Allan Rouse. He was involved with the Beatles anthology and the remasters, but Allan can tell you much more.
And the Love album as well. Basically, yes. Allan Rouse was was in charge of the archives at Abbey Road, and he went on staff there, I think, in 1972, and basically the first job he was given was to copy the entire Beatles archives. Well, probably not in 1972, but apparently early in his career, he was asked to copy the Beatles archives digitally, and he knew where everything was. And so if George Martin needed to come in and work, for instance, on the anthology, as you said, or even the BBC things he was involved with, although that stuff hadn't originally been in EMI's archives, but he was involved with that too. Basically, you would go through Allan Rouse to get the stuff you needed. And he was basically the overseer as well of the 2009 remasters. And that's basically the story. He was really sort of a background guy. He wasn't an engineer, so he didn't do the engineering on these projects, but he was involved in, let's say, the quality control of the whole remasters project. And so he died apparently today.
Right, but his name was out there enough that it's certainly recognizable to certainly Beatle audiophiles.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you look at the credits on all those CDs, you'll see his name right there. So
yeah,
exactly.
Right.
And actually, from what I read, he first worked with George Martin when George was putting together the Making of Sgt. Pepper special.
Right.
And he needed Allan's help for that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. He also worked on Live at the BBC.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that whole generation of Beatles archive releases that have come out beginning with Live at the BBC.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's certainly he's a significant piece of more recent Beatle history, and once again a loss in the Beatle family.
Yeah.
Now to our topic, and it's interesting because this is kind of, we're dealing here with a little bit of fantasy, a little bit of speculation, and while this was happening, along comes this rumor that came up within the last week. Eric Clapton has a new album, and one of the tracks has a basically a guitar part on it, which sounds suspiciously like George Harrison. Only problem is, it's not an archive track. It's part of his new album. And the fact of the matter is that George has been, shall we say, unavailable for nearly 15 years. So that's one of those things that happens in social media these days, where suddenly everybody goes crazy over some tiny little bit of speculation. But aside from that, we had decided for this particular show to do something, obviously in their post Beatles careers, as opposed to the group career where they really had very little in the way of sidemen. But in their post Beatles career, each of the Beatles worked with a number of different musicians and a number of different producers and all. And so we thought it might be interesting to kind of speculate on who we would like to see, and this would be somebody who would be living or dead, perhaps somebody who was not even a contemporary of a particular Beatle. We could basically select, in this case, 3 selections of somebody we would like to have seen or possibly could still see one of the Beatles work with, as either as a supporting player, possibly as a producer, possibly with the particular Beatle acting as a producer. So I thought, why don't we start with John Lennon, because that's probably the most problematic of these, and the one probably most dealing with speculation. And I'll throw my 3 nominations into the pool and see what comes up. By the way, that sound you hear in the background, that is Steve scratching out all of his selections as soon as they mentioned anything about a producer.
No. That's all right. Go.
Okay. Now, as I said, this could be somebody who was not particularly a contemporary of John Lennon's, and this my first selection is definitely not a contemporary, because his band U2 released their first album not long before, I believe, I think it was 1979 when they released their first album came out.
The first few U2 albums, I think, it's definitely late 70s.
Yeah.
So it's 78 or 79, yeah.
Right. So, they were really just kind of getting their career going when John's career suddenly ended. But Bono has always acknowledged that he is a Lennon disciple, and I would have loved to have seen John Lennon and Bono work together, whether it was, on stage or in the studio as fellow musicians, or with perhaps John producing, Bono either solo or with U2, whoever. I think that would have been a great match. My second selection is somebody that John actually talked about in the interviews that he gave. In fact, one particular interview that he gave to Rolling Stone 2 days before he was killed. But he had also mentioned being very interested in the career progression of Bruce Springsteen. As it happens, Bruce's album, The River, which in fact is basically the theme of his current tour, the anniversary, the 35th anniversary of the release of The River. The River was released basically right around The River, and also the single Hungry Heart were released right around the same time that Starting Over and Double Fantasy were released in October and November of 1980. And in fact, Bruce was playing at the Spectrum on the night of December 8th. And there's been speculation that that he may have in fact been playing Point Blank, which is a track from the river at the time that the shots were fired, and it's not out of the realm of possibility. But anyway, John had actually expressed a great deal of interest in the progression of Bruce's career, and he mentioned liking Hungry Heart quite a bit, and he was very interested to hear The River. Whether we actually got to hear it or not, we don't know. But again, considering the arc of Bruce's career, especially as he got beyond, as John mentioned in that interview for Rolling Stone, kind of beyond doing songs about cars and girls and writing about more serious matters, which in fact Bruce began doing with his next album, Nebraska. Again, I would love to have seen John Lennon and Bruce Springsteen work together again, either whether it was on stage or in the studio or in whatever form. I think it would have been absolutely great. My third selection is basically based on one TV appearance, and that is the appearance by Chuck Berry on the Mike Douglas Show, the week that John and Yoko co-hosted the show. And John and Chuck performed Johnny Be Good, and I would love to have seen at some point the two of them work together, perhaps in something similar to what Keith Richards did with Chuck. Hopefully with Chuck acting less of a dick than he did during the filming of what was it, Hail Hail Rock and Roll? Was that the title of the film?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Mm-hmm. But again, I would have loved to have seen, especially since, let's face it, Chuck was one of John's idols, his absolute musical idols. I think it would have been a musical match made in heaven, even if it was only for a couple of shows or maybe an album, whatever. So those are my three nominations for who I would have liked to have seen John Lennon work with. And,
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Are you picking, in the case of Bono and Bruce Springsteen, those two because you're fans of their work, or can you hear it in your head, John Lennon working with them? Because if I hear, say, a U2 song, it's not like I can hear John singing it. It's just my own reaction to it. His own musical style, Bono style, or Springsteen style, for that matter.
Yeah.
When I'm picking the artist that I have, I'm trying to envision one that kind of makes sense, where I can actually hear a Beatle sing with another artist and collaborate as a songwriter and vocally. Are you thinking about that as you're choosing these, or are they just favorite artists of yours?
No, I'm thinking in terms of musical compatibility, definitely, and I think certainly in the case of Bono, there's a great deal of musical compatibility. I could easily see John singing, I don't know, I Will Follow. Now, obviously, his voice was much different than Bono's.
Sure.
But I think musically they share a lot of the same roots.
Okay.
And I think the same, probably, and really the same with Bruce, because his musical roots are much the same as John's, even though he was somewhat younger, close to a decade younger. Mm-hmm. But I think again they were definitely musical, maybe not soulmates, but certainly very compatible musically. Right. And sure, I could see them I could see them working together. There are people that would say that it's tough to imagine Bruce and Paul working together, and yet they, at least on stage, they have worked together,
Mm-hmm.
and very well.
Right.
So I don't think, I think certainly in those two cases, it's absolutely within the realm of possibility, and certainly in the case of Chuck Berry, it would be.
Okay.
Okay. In fact, why don't we go with Ken and see what his selections are?
Well, before I do say my three here, I wanted to make sure some of the artists that I've listed for all four of the Beatles are artists that have worked with them already, but haven't worked extensively with them.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, mine too.
That's cool.
So in the case of John, I mean, to me, it's a natural to me to think of John with David Bowie. And as much as I love Fame and their cover of Across the Universe together, I just think that there's a lot of similarities between the two. And the fact that, David was constantly wanting change. John was certainly that way in the Beatles. There's no doubt about that. And I think that John would have fed off that. I think John would have loved to have worked with someone who was constantly creative, had a very fertile mind, never wanted to repeat himself, and he would have found that challenging. And I think that he respected David that way. And I think personality-wise, I think they got along fine. And we all know, certainly since David's passing, you've read these quotes about how he thought the world of John Lennon. So I think that those two would have been fantastic together. And, there's a lot of artists who the Beatles have done one-offs with, or maybe a couple songs. And you wish that maybe there'd be a full album with that artist. And David Bowie, if John Lennon made a full album with David Bowie, that would have been fascinating to me.
Exactly.
And likewise, I would say the exact same thing about Elton John. Elton John is someone who greatly admired John, and just listen to Whatever Gets You Through the Night. What a fantastic track that was. There was so much life in that track that Elton brought to it. And I just think those two would have been natural together.
Yeah, I that's a duplicate of mine, because I was imagining how the two of them would have. I mean, they've done single tracks, but they haven't really done an extensive project, and I would have loved to have seen them do a whole album together. I think that would have been really interesting. Yeah,
not only that, but you've got certain cases of artists who are known for just writing melodies, Elton being a primary example of that. So apply John Lennon's lyrics and also working on the melody maybe with Elton and see what you can come up with. It might have been fascinating. And just knowing how much the two of them, fed off each other and how well they worked together. Also on Elton's version of Lucy in the Sky and his cover of One Day at a Time. They both loved each other so much. I think that would have carried over into the music. You would have felt that, I think. And also, I was thinking Ray Davies.
Oh, yeah.
Because Ray is a big fan of John's, and I know he specifically points out John of all the Beatles. And certainly lyrically, the two of them are so brilliant, and melodically too. But Ray Davies, kind of like John, comes up with some really strong, biting, cynical lyrics, and I can easily see the two of them working together. So, and the Kinks really, of all the other great British invasion bands, to me come closest to the Beatles.
Yeah.
As far as their pop sensibilities, a lot of their music was a mixture of very strong melodic stuff, very poppy, but also with an edge to it, and certainly an edge lyrically with Ray's lyrics in particular. So, there's so many other artists I picked for John, but those would probably be my top three. I did mention in my list here Chuck Berry too, because John is one of those people who, when it comes to Chuck Berry's music, if anyone's ever going to cover it, whose voice is better than John's? Exactly. It's kind of like Paul with Little Richard. It's the same thing. So, I would pick the three that I said, and sorry if it's artists that John already worked with. But I think John picked two of the finest people there that he could collaborate with. David Bowie and Elton John.
Absolutely.
And throw in Ray Davies.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, it was actually David Bowie's passing that put this germ in my mind about something like this because of the fact that he only got the chance to work with John the one time, and it would have been really fascinating to see him work with John more throughout their career, as time wore on.
Right.
But and also to see if possibly if David had worked with any of the other Beatles.
I think it would have been interesting for him to pair up with Paul.
Yeah.
Because Paul is so musically eclectic. He can go in any direction.
Exactly.
And I could certainly see him being influenced by what David wanted. Definitely. And vice versa.
Sure. But Ray Davies, that's a great selection.
Thank you.
Definitely. Steve, how about you?
Well, I got a little. I used a little bit of. I fantasized a little bit, and I actually had. I'm not gonna go through. I'm gonna try and keep this short. But for John Lennon, I mean, besides Yoko Ono, who I really wanted to see him work with again, I was kind of assuming John was still around. But the first person that came to mind, and actually he's not still alive, would be Elvis. I would love to see the 50s Elvis and John together back in the day. I think that would have been. I mean, John has always acknowledged Elvis Presley as his influence, and to hear the two of them together, at that era and at that point of their lives would have been, I think, fantastic. Another person, like I said, I was just kind of flying off the handle here. And Allan probably knows this name well, is Blossom Dearie. And Blossom Dearie wrote a song about John, actually, and I have loved her voice ever since I went to a friend's house in Los Angeles, and Saki, if you're listening, it's you. And she was the one that turned me on to Blossom Dearie, and I have loved Blossom Dearie's voice ever since. And I loved the fact that Blossom Dearie wrote a song about John, and maybe wonder if maybe there was a little more there going on. But I would have loved to have seen the two of them work together. And another person that just came to me out of the blue completely, and I can't imagine how this would have worked, would have been Amy Winehouse. And I'm just being really imaginative here, and I have no idea how that would have worked. I mean, basically with Elvis, I think John could have worked with any of the old rock and rollers, but I was trying to be a little weird, and that's why I picked Amy Winehouse. I would have loved to have seen the two of them together. It would have been interesting. So there you go.
Or Kurt Cobain.
Yeah, not so much. I'm not as big a fan of Kurt Cobain. I like Amy Winehouse better than I like Kurt Cobain, but yeah, that would have been interesting too.
Yeah.
So
absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I could see Kurt Cobain actually, but I was thinking Chuck Berry naturally was on my list too. What I was thinking more for him though was that an album of new stuff, of new Chuck Berry, John Lennon collaborations. Maybe get Keith Richards in there too to keep have the two of them gang up on Chuck and keep him working. But because Chuck Berry doesn't really do new stuff anymore. But there may be something there that those two could have squeezed out of him. I was thinking as well of, in terms of people John has worked with, I kind of like that outtake of I'm Losing You with Cheap Trick. And I thought maybe, John and with Cheap Trick as a backing group, or perhaps collaborating on some songs could have been good. Equally, it could have been the Smithereens, Both of those groups have basically the sound that John was comfortable with. I was thinking maybe, before you mentioned Kurt Cobain, which may actually be a better idea in a way, but I was thinking of John and Elvis Costello, because Elvis Costello seems more a John guy than a Paul guy to me. Of course, when he started working with Paul, John wasn't as I think Al said, available.
Right.
But there's something about Elvis's cutting edge that works great with McCartney, because John's cutting edge worked great with McCartney. But I think the two of them, for the same reason that Ray Davies would be a good choice. Elvis Costello is a brilliant lyricist, and I think that could have worked. And then my third one, because I wasn't counting Chuck Berry really, since it was was John Cage.
I thought of that, Alan, and I wondered how it would work. But
here's how it would work.
Mm-hmm.
It would work in pretty much the same way that John's avant-garde stuff worked with Yoko, except that John Cage and Yoko in some ways work to similar kinds of rules in the sense that they start a piece. I mean, it may sound to a lot of our listeners as just a free-for-all, but they usually start with a set of conditions that have to be like Yoko's instruction pieces, breathe in, breathe out, or whatever. I mean, it's a simple kind of thing. But Cage's pieces sort of were a little more complex than that, but also involved taking into account what was going on, or throwing the I Ching, and selecting any of a number of predetermined actions and then doing them. I think John could have gotten into something like that because you listen to the zany tapes he made that were those sort of little radio shows and things, and there was also another unreleased avant-garde album that he recorded at least a side of, that there's film of him doing in Man of the Decade, and I think it was called Laugh, or the track was called Laugh. Basically everyone's laughing, but I think he could get into a situation where, say, he and Yoko and John Cage get together, decide what the pieces are going to be, and then do them. And I'm sure that he would bring something specifically of his own to it, perhaps as a guitarist. John Cage's stuff isn't really big on electric guitar, but John could have added that aspect. So those are my three for John.
Only little caveat I've got is that, do you think that maybe Elvis Costello and John might have been too similar?
Possibly. That's why I think maybe Kurt Cobain would have been a better choice than Elvis.
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah.
Because, especially vocally.
Yeah, that's true. But they would have been, I think, maybe so much on the same wavelength that.
Oh, sure.
And I think they would have pushed each other, because Elvis Costello's writing, depending what part of his career you're talking about.
I was just going to ask, which Elvis are we talking about?
Well, I don't know. It would have to be
the young angry Elvis, or the more
poetic later Elvis.
Yeah.
I think that would push John in an interesting direction, but I think the young angry Elvis is the one that John would have been immediately comfortable with.
Oh, I'm sure.
So yeah, those are mine.
Okay, well, we've taken a look at the musicians that we'd like to see John Lennon have worked with. Let's go with the other one that's kind of a problematic situation, in that the fact that, as mentioned, George Harrison hasn't been available for nearly 15 years. So I'll give my nominations first. During his career, George worked with, probably every major rock guitarist out there, except with the possible exception of Carlos Santana. But I've got two here that are not really specifically associated with rock and roll, but are two great guitarists of their era, although theirs didn't really specifically dovetail with John's. In fact, they're probably more associated in the country area than in rock and roll. One is Albert Lee, not Alvin Lee, who is a great country pop guitarist out of England.
Who is working with Peter Asher at the moment?
Is he?
Yes, he is.
Ah, I didn't know that. Oh,
they've been
great.
touring together.
Oh,
Yeah, they have.
that's
They have.
great.
Hmm.
That's great. And the other is Vince Gill, who I think probably most people know. Oh yeah, he had some country hits in the 90s, but actually has been a session player and a presence in Nashville as a great guitarist for some 25 years now, and has done absolutely great work. And I think I would love to see George work on stage with either Albert Lee or Vince Gill or in the studio. My third selection is actually a close friend of George's, and that's Carl Perkins. Other than the rockabilly session and a straight track here or there, they never worked together in the studio to any great extent. So I would love to have seen George and Carl do an entire album together.
Hmm.
And since Albert Lee and Vince Gill are kind of very similar in style, I figured I'd put in a fourth nomination, and that would be Danny Harrison, because
Hmm.
because as he has grown, I think it would have been very interesting if George had lived, to see how they would have meshed together musically.
Hmm.
And I think they would have been a great match. Obviously George taught him well, as is the other his other peers who obviously have worked with Danny, witnessed the Concert for George. So I think George and Danny Harrison would have been a match, a musical match made in heaven, so to speak.
Hmm.
Hmm.
So when it comes to Albert Lee
Yeah.
and Vince Gill, you're talking more as a guitar player, working with that as opposed to as a songwriter?
Yeah, more. I would say more as fellow guitarists.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Much in the way that George and Eric have worked together
Mm-hmm.
over the years.
Okay.
And how about yours, Ken?
Well, my number one pick was very easy because one of my all-time favorite performances from any Beatle is when George Harrison performed with Paul Simon on Saturday Night Live. And those two just sounded so natural together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, Paul Simon's one of those people where, I could see him with John, I could see him with Paul, I could see him with George. But
Yeah.
seeing the two of them together on that stage and how well they harmonized, let's face it, John, Paul, and George don't get nearly enough credit for being great harmony singers. And you're dealing with the same camp with Simon and Garfunkel. So when you're dealing with Paul Simon and George Harrison, they sing together so well, they play guitar together so well. It was such a natural, those two together, that I always wished, after seeing those two together, that they would make an album together. And, I just think that performance was so wonderful. I just wish that they had done more. And I think they would have gotten along great. I really do. You can talk about egos getting in the way. I don't think that would have happened with Paul Simon and George Harrison.
No.
They had a mutual respect for each other. And I'm sure Paul Simon also had, a deep respect for John and Paul, too.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know why. I think George fell in really well with Paul Simon at that moment. And they're such great guitar players, both of them, and so great on acoustic guitar. And it just was so natural, those two together. He's my number one pick, without a doubt, Paul Simon.
Mm-hmm.
Second one, you're going to be baffled by my saying this because I picked Eric Clapton. And the only reason why I picked Eric Clapton is that even though they've done a lot of work together, they didn't write together outside of Badge, and that's the only song we know of that's a Harrison Clapton composition. But I would have loved for the two of them to write together. That would have been, there's so many songs that Eric Clapton's done through the years where I could have heard George do it or play on it. And certainly a lot of Eric's slide guitar solos, Wonderful Tonight especially. There are certain songs like that that I can easily hear George being on. I know the subject matter was Patty, but I'm just saying in that particular case, there are songs throughout Eric's career where you can say, well, that's very Harrison-esque, you know? So they were a natural pair together. I really think that, you know, whatever they did together, to me, was dynamite. I thought they were a natural pair, George Harrison and Eric Clapton. I also would include Carl Perkins as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because of George's love for Carl and his love for rockabilly. Mm-hmm. And I always go back to that wonderful concert, Carl Perkins and Friends.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the greatest moments ever live is seeing George light up, being on stage with Carl, and not only playing so well, but he was so full of life and looking up to Carl like, you know, he was his hero, which he was, one of his heroes.
Absolutely.
And there is a song that the two of them worked on together on the Go Cat Go album from Carl Perkins, Distance Makes No Difference with Love, which Carl wrote, and it's a wonderful, beautiful song, and you can hear George's background vocals on that song and his slide guitar work, and it was gorgeous. And I think those two would have been just a killer pair together.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely Carl Perkins was in there. There's a number of other people I'd like to throw into the mix, but those would be my top three.
Do you want to throw a couple in?
Yeah, members of the band.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think George is very influenced by the band around the time of All Things Must Pass. I could hear him working with different members, Robbie Robertson. You know, I can easily hear that. I can't say Bob Dylan because he did write a lot with Bob Dylan and the Traveling Wilburys.
Right, of course.
You know, you can't mention the Traveling Wilbury, really. Since I mentioned rockabilly, throw in Dave Edmunds. You know, throw in Brian Setzer. You know, the same people that were in the Carl Perkins TV special.
Right.
And actually, I wish he had done a little bit more collaborating as a songwriter with Billy Preston. I think those two were a great team. And even you mentioned him a few moments ago, Al. How about Carlos Santana?
Yeah.
There is that element of spirituality in Santana's music. So I think they would have connected on that level.
Yeah. It just happened that I was thinking that he had worked with, as I said, almost every major guitarist of his era, and then Carlos Santana's name popped into my brain, and then said, "Oh, that's right. He never did work with him, did he?" So
no, he didn't.
Yeah. So that would be a natural.
I'm just wondering, between the three of you, since I mentioned Paul Simon, between John Paul and George, who do you think Paul Simon would work best with?
Gosh,
I actually say Paul.
How come?
Just the softness of you know the melodic style of Paul Simon.
They've worked together too. They've worked together. Apart from that couple of minutes on Saturday Night Live 40th anniversary, they also played at one of those charity shows.
The Neil Young
one of the music care shows,
or the school that Neil Young has an annual.
Oh yes,
the Bridge Benefit concert.
The Bridge Benefits, yeah, and I think they did an acoustic kind of set. So yeah.
But I mean, writing together.
Yeah, I think any of them would have been really good, and but maybe George might have been the most interesting.
Yeah, I think so.
Because he was a little bit out of the way, you know, and you never knew exactly what he was going to come up with, and that would have, I think, worked well with Paul Simon. Paul Simon was on my list too, and so was Carl Perkins. So I've only got one guy left. So Steve better not come up with it.
Sorry, Alan.
Steve, who would you have seen George Harrison work with?
Well, I did have Danny. I did have Carl Perkins. So those two are out. I had actually a couple of oddball picks. I mentioned a week or so ago, I love Stefan Grappelli. I thought of Stefan Grappelli. I think that would be really interesting. It'd be, you know, completely different from what you'd ever expect George Harrison to do. While we were sitting here talking about people that George Harrison had worked with, the one name that cropped into my mind was Duane Eddy. You guys know the Duane Eddy album that has George Harrison on it?
Mm-hmm.
Those two tracks are two of my favorite George Harrison guest tracks, and I would have loved to have seen them do a whole thing together. I also thought about Monty Python. If George had done more with Monty Python, either comedy or music, I think that would have been a lot of fun. And don't ask me why I thought of this, even though Paul has worked with her. Diana Krall, who I absolutely love to listen to. I think they would have been great together. But that's that's a weird pairing. I admit, but
not
Well,
really.
it makes sense because
Yeah.
George does all those standards.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would have worked nicely.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the Dwayne Eddy thing, well, I mean, that wasn't originally on my list, but when we were sitting here talking about that, I just went, oh yeah, I should have picked Dwayne Eddy for sure, because those two tracks, the Trembler and Theme from Something Important, just knock me over every time I hear them. They're just fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
So,
In fact, a name that popped into my brain when I was first thinking about this was was Slim Whitman.
oh my God. Oh my!
Well, George has mentioned him as an
Yeah,
influence.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and who knows? I'm not I'm not quite sure how good a match that would have been, but
Right.
you never know. And Alan, who was your third selection?
Well, I'm amazed that no one has come up with it, but I'm sure it was on the tip of someone's tongue,
Mhm.
and that would be Chet Atkins. Because
Oh.
I never
Chet
thought of
Atkins,
that.
George really admired Chet Atkins, and since a lot of what we've come up with George in particular, but the others too are their old heroes.
Mhm.
Chet Atkins, is in there. George mentioned him early on as an influence or someone whose records he would listen to and want to be a guitarist of that accomplishment. And Chet Atkins himself did so many different things in so many different styles and did an album of Beatles stuff. And
Mhm.
so I kind of think that if someone had put them together for a project, it could have been a really sort of interesting thing. I also felt with Carl Perkins that a whole album of stuff would have been. I mean, with all of my things, actually, I'm thinking more in terms of whole albums of new stuff rather than just going on stage and playing or something.
Yeah.
But so that was my remaining George Harrison thing. And since we're probably running low on time, I will just cede the rest of my time to the next topic, which would be what, Al?
Well, any honorable mentions?
Well, I mean, I had written but crossed out that I wish he had done something more extensive with Dylan. Not counting the Traveling Wilburys. Just an album that the two of them might have come up with. They worked together a bit around the time of Dylan's New Morning. George, went over to New York and they did a session together.
Right.
I kind of think that the two of them might have been interesting as collaborators in that way, and that. Once I realized that probably because he did work so much with him in the Wilburys and elsewhere, that wouldn't really be a good choice. That was what led me on to Paul Simon as the next idea. But I don't actually have any other honorable mentions. George was a really hard one to come up with collaborators for, because he turned up playing with so many people, Deep Purple, and I mean, you never knew when he was going to turn up, and it was always kind of interesting. So, but yeah, how about George and Elvis? Not Elvis Costello, Elvis Presley. George and Scotty Moore and Elvis.
Yes.
Oh
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
You could say that with Paul.
Well, and with Paul playing Bill Black's bass.
Right. Can I ask the three of you a question?
Please.
You just mentioned Bob Dylan, and it occurred to me none of us picked Bob Dylan for John. I wonder why that is, considering the fact that John was a big fan.
Yeah.
Bob loved John. Is there any reason why none of us mentioned Bob Dylan as a collaborator for John Lennon?
I don't know. That is strange, isn't it?
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe maybe we felt that Dylan wasn't quite in John's kind of, more rock and roll pop musical wheelhouse, that it was somewhat outside of that, then that's, I think that's probably at least a stab at a reason why.
I can see that. That makes sense.
Yeah. Any dissenters on that?
Mm-mm.
Yeah.
But you couldn't see John with Bob Dylan doing an acoustic guitar album?
I really couldn't see John doing an acoustic guitar album.
Right. Yeah, no, I couldn't either.
I mean, obviously, yes, there is an album called Acoustic, but that's a posthumous release, which is, a lot of that is demos. But I really can't imagine John, of course, who knows, because, how, what his career arc might have, where that might have gone in, if he'd been given the opportunity. But at least the John Lennon that we know, I can't imagine that John Lennon doing an acoustic album.
Of course, Dylan wanted to be a rocker, and there was that whole period in the mid 60s when he sort of was.
Yeah. I
don't know. They might have found common ground.
It just was a little difficult for me to imagine John and Bob Dylan together.
It's easier to imagine John and Bob Dylan than George and John Cage.
Yes.
He would have said his avant-garde clue thing, and Cage would have been out of there.
Right.
So those are our nominations for artists that we would like to have seen George Harrison work with. Now let's turn to the, at least one of the, time permitting, one of the two Beatles who we do still have with us, and that would be Ringo Starr. And obviously the temptation is to pick people who would be good for the all-star band, that kind of thing. And I tried to kind of avoid that. I tried to stick with people that I thought he, would work well with Ringo, if not in the all-star band format, then perhaps in the studio, whether it's an actual studio or Ringo's bedroom, as he's done with the last several albums. And my first selection is actually definitely in the area of fantasy, because unfortunately it can never happen, and that's Ken mentioned them in connection with George, the band. Obviously, I believe 4/5 of the band played on Sunshine Life for Me, on Ringo's 1973 for his first mainstream solo album. But I've always felt that especially with Ringo's sort of country / folk leanings, that I've always felt that the band would have lent itself very well to backing up Ringo. And in fact, Rick Danko and Levon Helm were part of the very first all-star band.
Right. And
unfortunately, 2 of the 4 members of that band who are no longer with us. So I would nominate the band. The other one is actually pretty obvious, because Joe Walsh is Ringo's brother-in-law. Joe Walsh did produce the Old Wave album in the early 80s, and has obviously worked with Ringo within the All-Star Band and in other forms. But I would love to see the 2 of them get together and do do a full and go into a real studio, where obviously Joe is a master, and do a full album together, especially, now, frankly, since there's probably not going to be any further Eagles reunion tours, Joe probably has some extra time. So I think it would be nice to see the two of them do a full album together with Joe producing and lending his abilities as a guitarist and songwriter and whatever else. And my third selection is Vince Gill, as I've always been a fan of Ringo's Vocal Blues album. And at that time, he used the cream of the Nashville session pickers, and the hot Nashville session picker of that time was Jerry Reed. And while Vince Gill is not the hot session picker of this era, which is kind of beside the point because that's not really what today's country music is about, still he's a great guitarist, not just in the country field. He's done jazz, he's done other types of music. He also does production, and so I think that he and Ringo would also be a great match in the studio. And it might be nice to see him work on stage with Ringo, but I can understand why he really wouldn't fit into the all-star band format, that kind of thing. So those are my three selections for Ringo. Ken, how about yours?
Ringo is probably the toughest because I'm not sure if I should think of him as a songwriter or strictly as a drummer, or both. There are times when I'd love to see Ringo drum for someone else, and because I've been so impressed in recent years with how much Ringo has been writing, but yet at the same time, it's hard for me to imagine as a songwriter who would Ringo work best with. Ringo has such a distinct style in all of his songs, and yet the different people that he's written with, most recently on his last few albums, really kind of, they pave the way for the style of each song too. They have such a big influence, I think, in the direction that the songs are going. But kind of like you, Al, I was thinking in a country direction. Mm-hmm. And I really also thought that the band would work really well with Ringo, doing something with Ringo. And like you said, the Ringo album, Sunshine Life for Me, Ringo was there at the last waltz. I think that he would have worked really well with members of the band. It's hard to pick one specific person, but I would definitely like to have liked him work more with members of the band because of his love for country. And I was told many years ago that he loved the outlaw music of the 70s, maybe somebody like a Waylon Jennings. I know that he worked with Willie Nelson for Write One for Me on the Ringo Rama album. Right. Someone like that. I think that Ringo would work very well with classic country artists. I'm not sure how he feels about current country because I never have heard him talk about any artist of today in the country field that he would like. But there are a lot of people that, like you said, Bukuza Blues, I think, was so suitable for Ringo. He really fits the country genre so well. And to work with any of the classic country artists, I think, even Dolly Parton, believe it or not. I know that may sound funny, but she's a huge Beatle fan. And, people from, say, the 60s and 70s and those artists who are still active from that time period, I'd like to see Ringo work with those. I'm kind of curious, and I'm not quite sure how you guys would feel about this, but it might be interesting to hear Ringo work with another drummer. And I was thinking in particular, what would it be like if Ringo worked on a project with Phil Collins? And the only reason I mention Phil Collins is because Phil is such a huge Beatle fan, and he has such respect for the drumming in particular that Ringo did in the Beatles. What would they work on together?
They've never worked together before?
Well, live.
Yeah.
They work together, but not in the studio.
Really?
No.
Yeah, I think it would be fine.
I don't,
Yeah.
Phil Collins doesn't come across to me as really distinctive. I thought about drummers too, but I didn't think Phil Collins didn't come to mind.
As
There
a
were two,
drummer, you don't think he's distinctive?
I don't, I didn't, well, I mean, I don't think he's as distinctive as the other person I was thinking of. I think I would have loved to have seen Ringo work with Keith Moon
Mm-hmm.
myself. And actually, not to get ahead of it, but I had also picked Mickey Dolenz as kind of a all-star band thing. But I think Mickey Dolenz would be great. And actually, I asked Mickey in an interview a year or two ago, and he said he would absolutely love to be in the all-star band. I mean, they know each other from way back, so they're they're old friends.
Sure.
He used to hang around in the in the Crazy Days.
Yeah. Right.
Because he was a good friend of Harry Nilsson's.
Yep.
So, but I think Phil Collins just doesn't spark me. It doesn't get me excited. Keith Moon and Mickey Dolenz would, however.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Ken, did
It's
you have
kind of
any other?
interesting in a way, because when you think of Ringo as a drummer, you're thinking about someone who plays to the song.
Yeah.
And it's really all the interesting fills that he brings to the song. He's not a show-off person,
Right.
and Keith Moon was the exact opposite of that.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if it's an interesting thing to bring up. When you want someone to work with a Beatle, do you want that person to be someone who was heavily influenced by that Beatle, where it shows, or do you want someone who could take that Beatle in a different direction and have a huge influence?
Well, Keith would have also been entertaining on his own. I mean, I don't know if you guys ever saw him, but I did on a couple of occasions. And he was not only a great drummer, he also put on a show. He was a comedian. He was everything. And Ringo is kind of a comedian too. I mean, Ringo's very, his humor is great on stage. So I think the two of them together, the question is whether or not they actually could have gotten away with it and managed to do something without completely going nuts. But I think it would have been fun to see the two of them together. I mean, I remember seeing the Who in 1970 in San Francisco, and Bill Graham introduced them one at a time, and Keith was sitting there banging on the drums as they were introducing everybody. I mean, he couldn't keep still for a minute, and so I think it would have been very entertaining. So
I know they were best friends, but their drumming styles were so completely different. I don't know if they would have worked together that well, but
who knows?
Yeah. Perhaps the drumming styles might not have jibed, but certainly, as Steve says, they would certainly have been entertaining, if nothing else.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. Ken, did you have anybody else, or should we move to Steve?
Let's go with Steve.
Okay.
Well, I had actually a couple of country people. I mentioned Mickey Dolenz already, and I mentioned Keith Moon.
Right.
But I had Willie Nelson, Johnny Cash, Buck Owens. Buck Owens would be the natural because of, Act Naturally. I think they would have had fun together. But I also mentioned somebody. I mentioned two other people, one of which I'm surprised nobody's mentioned yet, would be Billy Preston. Only because, I saw Billy with the All-Star Band, and he was absolutely tremendous. And, and he was great in Bangladesh, and that would have been fun. And I also mentioned Harry Nilsson. I would have loved to have seen Ringo and Harry do a whole album together. That would have been, I think that would have been really awesome. I mean, obviously in that case, it would have been Harry's songs, but I think the musicianship, and I can just imagine who they would have pulled together for that one. But that would have been a lot of fun. I got to say that I think a lot about Harry now. His music was really fantastic. So.
Well, don't forget, Ringo wrote material from the 70s on up, so he could have written songs with Harry.
Yeah,
sure.
Wouldn't have had to have been strictly Harry's composition, totally.
No, but Harry, Harry was so distinctive. Harry's music was so distinctive. It would have been great to hear what they worked together on, or if they did write together what they would have come up on. But Harry, I think, would have taken the lead for sure on that. So,
although again, they were so close personally that maybe as was the case with Keith Moon, that maybe it might not have worked terribly well because of the fact that they were so close personally.
I think it probably would have worked better than Keith Moon, but
like John and Harry were close, but not as close as Ringo and Harry. They were absolute soulmates. They were best friends.
Right. So, Harry. I mean, Ringo didn't do any interviews for the Harry Nilsson documentary for that reason.
Very true.
So, anyway, I'm done.
Okay.
Take it away.
And Allan?
Okay, yeah, Ringo was really hard for me. Maybe because with all three of the others, despite the All-Stars, I don't think of him as a front man in the same way. And I couldn't really think in terms of what I was thinking of Ringo doing in a collaboration. That said, I could see him playing on George Harrison's collaboration with Chet Atkins. I think Carl Perkins comes up in almost all of these pairings. I think Ringo and Carl Perkins could have done something, a full length project that would have been interesting. But one, odd thing struck me is Mark Knopfler. Now, I don't know why Mark Knopfler for Ringo more than the others, but for some reason, it just seems to, because Mark Knopfler has that little bit of an edge of country, but also rock and roll. And I kind of think the two of them would be amenable. It would be a nice pairing if they wrote together, or even if they just came up with something where Mark Knopfler's doing most of the writing, but they're collaborating on the full project. But my main one, I can, top the idea of Ringo collaborating with another drummer and have him collaborate with 4 other drummers. There is a classical new music group called So Percussion. And So Percussion does all kinds of stuff. I mean, usually they're full-length evenings of one composer's stuff. One of them composes. They have just finished or just putting out an album written for them by Glenn Cacci from Wilco, who's been writing a lot of classical stuff. I mean, they're not a crossover group. They're a serious, new music classical group. And why I was thinking about them was that, in I think 1967, 68, the Beatles did one of these unreleased avant-garde projects along the lines of Carnival of Light, but it was apparently all percussion, and it was led by Ringo. And if he has any interest in that kind of stuff, So Percussion are the guys for him to work with, because, I mean, they do, you go to one of their concerts, it's not only marimbas and vibraphones and all the usual percussion stuff and trap set items and things like that. They've got squeaky toys and cans and tire irons, you name it. And I kind of think that, I'd like to hear how imaginative Ringo could be as a drummer. I mean, we've heard how imaginative he can be as a drummer in a rock group, and it's pretty imaginative. But here we're talking about all percussion. And I kind of think that, he could just go crazy and they would be, perfect collaborators for that. I'd love to see something like that. He could actually out avant-garde Paul.
Yeah.
And but come up with the stuff So Percussion does. I mean, I really love them, and it's, you wouldn't think that full evening of percussion music is necessarily going to be that interesting, but it is when they play it, and there are other percussion ensembles now too, but I think they're one of the best. And I think that, I don't know why, I just think that could be a great collaboration. Let him just go nuts. Drumming is his madness.
Yeah. Exactly. That's very interesting. I mean, it's not out of the realm of possibility because, because Ringo has over the years talked about, the influence of drummers from other musical genres, people like Buddy Rich
Hmm.
on him. So something like that definitely, it's not as wild as it sounds.
No, I don't think so. I'll tell you another reason. I guess in the back of my mind is I went to a taping of something Ringo did. Might have been Artist Den. I'm not sure. It was taped at the Metropolitan Museum, and he did some things. I don't know if they ended up in the finished show. They may not have actually, but there was one piece where he was standing in front drumming on. I'm not even sure what it was. Maybe a conga, and the skin broke, and so his drum tech had to, replace the drum or replace the skin, and so he was talking while that was going on, and it just seemed to me, I mean, like anybody who plays an instrument, your instrument is so much part of you in a way.
Sure.
And somehow or another, as a guitar snob, I guess I never really thought that way, that it was like that for drummers too. But in this incident, you could really see it. And I thought, there's something that aside of Ringo that we haven't really seen in full flight. And that is, the whole, drummerama thing, and I just would love to see that.
Well, hey, his drums loom large in his legend.
That's true.
That's true.
Okay, well, I think we've finished up with Ringo. Now we have one Beatle left, but we're well over time anyway. So I think we're going to have to save Mr. McCartney for another time, and especially since that's going to be a battle royal. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of nominations, so that could fill up an entire show. So we will save Mr. McCartney for that one, definitely. But this has been a lot of fun. Absolutely. And I think we need to wrap it up here. And first of all, let me go over to Ken, because I think he's got some plugs relating to his website and to his radio show.
Actually, yes, on my website, which is kenmichaelsradio.com. I mentioned this in our last show, but there's a special contest that I'll be doing. And if anyone's listening, as soon as the show is posted, which is on a Saturday, I'm doing one for Kid O'Toole's two most recent books. One is called Songs We Were Singing, Guided Tours to the Beatles' Lesser-Known Tracks. And she also has a new book out on Michael Jackson called Michael Jackson FAQ. And you can win both books on my website. Just go to kenmichaelsradio.com for all the details for that. And one other thing I wanted to mention is that on March the 6th, I'm going to be emceeing a concert for two Beatles tribute bands. And I know Steve is familiar with both of them. One of them is called After Fab, and this is a band that specializes in just solo Beatle music, and they're fantastic. They're out of Massachusetts. And there's another band called Studio 2. And this band plays early Beatles music, the earliest Beatle music that they did for Parlophone, but also the stuff they used to do in Hamburg and on BBC Radio. And they mix all that together. So it's not the typical stuff that you would expect to hear in a Beatle band for actually both these groups, After Fab and Studio 2. They're playing at the Hukilau Music Hall in Chicopee, Massachusetts. And that's on March the 6th, and I'll be introducing both bands. So if you're in the Massachusetts area, do stop by. It's going to be an extra special treat because these are two very unique Beatles tribute bands. And, stop by, say hello to me, and talk Beatles.
That's great. Sounds like a great evening. Steve, how about our contact information?
You can get a hold of the show at thingswesaidtodayradioshow@gmail.com. We have actually two Facebook pages, a radio show page and a group page where you can talk about the show. I'm on Facebook under my name and under Beatles Examiner. I'm all over Facebook, actually. But yeah, I mean, you can get a hold of me at BeatlesExaminer@gmail.com if you want to write me about anything Beatle-wise. There's all sorts of things going on. So anyway, that's about it.
Okay, and Allan, anything you need to plug?
No, I don't think so. You can get in touch with me on Facebook under just Allan Kozinn or Allan Kozinn Remixed, and or at any of the group's pages.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you can contact me at www.beatlefan.com, where Allan and I heartily endorse our colleague Kit O'Toole's books. Absolutely. Kit is, of course, a long-time member of the Beatle fan family, so we will go to any lengths to plug her fine books. Absolutely. And as I said, you can contact us at www.beatlefan.com and www.paradingpress.com, on Facebook at Al Sussman, and on Twitter at ASUSS49. Well, this has been a fun exercise. At least I thought. At least I had fun. And for Steve Marinucci and Ken Michaels and Allan Kozinn, this is Al Sussman. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.